All right, folks, we have got a cracking episode for you today. Ben is even calling it a mega episode because we're going to be unpacking a fundamental framework that will give you an unfair advantage going into the future about where property prices will grow in value. We're going to talk about short term. We're going to talk about long term, Ben, but what exactly are we going to talk about?
So, Bryce, we're going to be unpacking sustained price growth, not just short-term demand and supply, which drives short-term growth. It's a huge episode. There's lots of fundamentals around the theories that we use and the thesis for prosecuting our argument. So it is a megasode, Bryce. So let's get into the show right now.
Welcome to the Property Couch, where each week you get to listen to two of Australia's leading experts. Bryce Holdaway, co-host of Location Australia on Foxtel's Lifestyle Channel, co-host of Escape from the City on the ABC, and partner of Empower Wealth Advisory. Ben Kingsley, chair of Property Investors Council of Australia and the founder of Empower Wealth Advisory, named the 2018 and 2019 Property Advisory Firm of the Year. Stay tuned as they bring you the insider's guide to property, finance and money management.
All right, folks, welcome back to the Property Couch podcast and welcome back, Ben. How are you?
Mate, I am well. Look, I'm super excited about this episode. It's probably one of our biggest episodes ever for so many reasons.
Yeah.
So, it is. And we've left it to the very last show of the year before we click into summer series.
100%. So, Ben, we're going to unpack some gold. So we're going to go back to the old days and really put some meat and potatoes on an incredible framework that we think is going to add a lot of value to a lot of people. So we'll set the scene on that shortly. But before we do, Ben, we have reached an incredible milestone in the history of our journey and our movement to help people better manage their money. So talk us through it, mate.
Well, mate, I'm delighted to say, I mean, if for those people who've been listening for a while, it's like, it's been coming and coming and coming.
Big day.
The mobile app is here, Bryce.
What? That can't be true. What does that mean?
Here.
I can do it on the go.
Moorr, MOOR, is now available on iTunes or through Apple devices and also through Android. But here's the deal, or through Google. When you do go into Google, it's going to auto-correct it. So you just have to, so when you're trying to look for it to download it on your Android device, Google's got this algorithm that auto-corrects it with an E on the end. No, just override that, get it to reset, and then it'll find it. Now, it'll learn, the Android version will learn that MOOR, and so you will find it. It's just not, it's not the automatic. Whereas when you're in the Apple Store, or the App Store in Apple, it's just MOOR. You'll find it there. And so, Bryce,
hang on, Ben, ready? Just drop the mic.
Drop the mic. I should have got me a little whistle. Wait a sec. Let me go and get my whistle.
It's been a little while since you pulled out the whistle, but that, folks, do you know how many people have come up to us and said, go on, Ben, go. Oh, no, you've got no air in your tyres. I could see it, but no one could hear it. So that was you blowing out your streamer. Is it finally... No. Are you on mute? No.
Still not hearing it.
Go one more time.
No.
There is nothing to hear, folks. So I'm going to have to explain what Ben just did. You know those little streamers that blow out of your mouth and they extend and they go...
That's interesting. Obviously, there's a bit of software in there that they feel like that's external noise and that. I'm going to have to fix that. The Stig's going to have to fix that.
Ben, so that means we've got over 50,000 people registered in that platform. They can now go and download Moorr, log in, and all of a sudden it's on the go. So no longer can anyone say to us, and we've had a few people over the journey say this to Ben, really love the platform, but as soon as it's on mobile, I'll really get into it, right? So we've got those people. Because typically you had to be on a desktop, but when you're doing real life transactions, you need to be... So I am personally beyond excited. This is a platform that we use, Ben. So not only is this a feature for the community, but all of a sudden it's just a world of opportunity and possibility for you and I, who are user number one and user number two of this platform.
And for those who are existing users, just works like a charm. You just, instead of creating a new account, you just log in and all your data comes up into it. You've got the new goal setting section. You've got the money smarts on the go. You've got the new features around the card system that allows you to then name the cards. You can put notes in there against the cards. And now we're downhill skiing. From here, we have got
100%.
some new information and some new product and features that are coming that are just going to transform the behavior around money. So that's what gets me the most excited. We've had to effectively rebuild it from the ground up into a modern platform. It's all there. Obviously, you've still got the web version there as well. So yeah, it's just a platform. You can now access it via the web, or you can access it via the app on your mobile phone.
Now, Ben, I know it was free in the past, but now it's a mobile app. Surely that's changed. So tell them, how much is it going to cost for them to download the app? Here we go.
It's completely free, Bryce.
What?
It will be free forever for those people who want to use Money Smarts and use the basic features. It is completely free for those people. But we do have, look, for full disclosure, we've got some cracking stuff that's coming. So some of that might be under a subscription model down the track. But at the moment, and here's the point, the Money Smarts will always be free. The 100%. Money Smarts live version will always be free.
10 minutes a month or less, that bit's free.
That is completely free. Will stay free forever. But we've got bank feeds coming. We've got all these other things that are going to be coming into the future that will just make basically money on autopilot is where we're heading. And so there's going to be some really interesting opportunities to show insights. And it's built with the mindset, Bryce. So if you're thinking about being a budding property investor in the future, or you are an active property investor, the property pillar inside the platform is going to start to, in 2023, you're going to see, it's the one place that you'll want to manage all of your property portfolio information. That's all I'll say. That's all I'll say.
That's all you'll say. We're going after that particular segment of the market. It's built by property investors for property investors. And here's the deal, right? Anyone can use it. So you don't have to be a property investor.
No.
But it's being built by people that have a paradigm around, I've got investment properties. I need to know how to manage them better. I need to be able to curate. I need to be able to take it out of all my spreadsheets. I need to be able to see these insights on the go. So that's where we're going. So folks, if you've been around for a little while and you're a devotee to the way that we teach money management, that is incredible news for you. For those people who are new, if you want to manage your money in less than 10 minutes a month, go to makemoneysimpleagain.com.au. You can download our book. It's the manual for free. And as part of that onboarding process, you will get introduced to the Moorr platform. Or just go to your app store or Android store and just get access to it. So we've labored on it, folks. It is exciting. It will help you. It will help you with my Mindset Minute, which I'm about to talk to, Ben, as well. So it is a major, major, major milestone for us. So it was worth celebrating, as you say on our last show, before we click into summer series mode next week, which is good. So that's
four pillars, Bryce. If I can just remind people of the four big pillars it's being built on. Lifestyle by design, which is the goal setting. Then you've got money, then you've got property, and then you've got wealth. So they are the four pillars that hopefully allow you to bring lifestyle by design together. And we are going to leave no stone unturned, because this is our mission. It's what we're here for. It's about changing people's lives, and it's about financial transformation. So to achieve that financial piece. So our 7 grades is coming in there. All of that stuff is going to be, mate, there is so much coming. So the team now can go faster now that we've sort of done all the critical back engine and back-end infrastructure to allow it to go faster.
I thought I was aware of most debt, Ben, but you introduced me through the process to a thing called tech debt.
Yes.
Which, the nerds will know exactly what that is. For me, it was like, oh, okay, but now we've got rid of the tech debt.
Yes.
We can get on with it. So for those of you that don't know what tech debt is, you're probably going to Google it. It's probably not relevant to you, but it's fixing up code, Ben.
Old infrastructure, old code, old system, old databases. It's all brand new, all good to roll.
All fun. Hey, we've hinted at it. No, we haven't hinted at it. We've been pretty blatant. Summer series starts next week, folks. Yep. We are super excited. The transformational stories that we get to share are incredible. The backstories that you and I have already had the privilege of understanding before we talk to our guest, Ben. So that's super exciting. But what I want to say to folks is this. I understand that when you knock off for the end of the year, you're in your routine throughout the year. So for 48 weeks or 49 or 50 weeks of the year, you're getting on the train, you're going to the gym, you're doing your workouts, you're doing your walk, you're listening to us. And then when you get to the end of the year, you change up your routines, and you may not be listening to us as part of your routine. We obviously hope that you are, Ben, but you may be listening to other things, right? So what I want to do is say the format is different, and they're just wonderful stories where you get to hear what's going on for people, what were the challenges that they overcame. And so I just want to encourage you that if you can get a chance to squeeze that into your holiday listening, I'd certainly want to encourage you to do that, because these stories are everyday people doing everyday things, converting knowledge into action, taking steps, and you get to see, the good, the bad, and the ugly of what they've been doing. And I think it's an incredible opportunity to be a fly on the wall and listen to some of these conversations, Ben. So we are pumped. We are pumped. Hey, Mindset Minute theme today. There was a survey that was released by Relationships Australia. I just want to shout out the Money Mag for bringing this to my attention. Around what it does is it shows that money creates relationship problems for 1 in 5 relationships. Ben, 1 in 5. That's too many, right? So it says that these relationships are impacted by financial issues because as more of us grapple with those increasing living costs, that number could actually change. So they came up with 5 tips for dealing with the financial stress in a relationship, and I thought they were really good conversation starters for you and me. I've got the headlines of those 5 points. I want you and I to riff through them, but I figure as we're on the doorstep of Christmas and the holiday season, it is an expensive time of the year. And what we want to do is have some contribution where we can to make sure that people don't get into relationship stress. Hopefully, the Moorr can be platform can be part of that, Ben, part of that conversation. But here are the top 5 tips that Relationships Australia have offered for dealing with stress in a relationship. Number 1 is start a conversation. Right, obvious place to start, Ben, but that's actually not easy. It's not easy to actually, if you're having challenges with that, it in practice, it's actually not easy to open the batting on that sort of conversation. So you really want to let your partner know that you'd like to talk about finances and set a time to actually have a talk about it, Ben. And importantly, don't use a trigger to be.
Yes, that's what I was about to say. Yeah.
You talk to that point, Ben, but we don't want to let a trigger be the catalyst to a conversation.
No, you don't want to be starting a conversation when you're arguing about money. Look, you need to be thinking about it to sort of say, hey, let's get together for an hour and then just sort of start to put some information together and get that conversation started when we're not elevated in our emotion, when we're effectively, in a simple, open-minded space, because it's natural to get defensive. It's natural to, have our biases. So, but that's a first starting point.
100%. So number 1 is start a conversation. And number 2 is seek to understand what money means to you, right? And I think this is really important because our views on money are shaped by multiple factors from culture to upbringing, right? So discovering what money means to each other can help as a really good way of moving forward. And what I found in my own relationship, Ben, is my norms are different to my wife's norms. So we've actually had those conversations around, well, what did money look like when you were growing up, and what does it mean to you, and what's the value of it to you, and what were the observations that you saw? So those conversations that we have on the podcast around what were the discussion you had over the dinner table, we're having those, but we're also looking back and reflecting on 2 people in a marriage, and this happens in all parts of a marriage, not just the finances. What's the norm around raising children? What's the norm around the values you have? What's the norm around the guidelines that you can provide? But in this context around money, super important to understand from each other's perspective so that you can walk a mile in their shoes, so that you can have a better understanding of where you have common ground, where you need to really find a negotiating point to find that common ground, Ben. So understanding what money means to you is number 2. Number 3 is know what you spend. Okay, so consider tracking joint expenses for a month. And then here's the important part. Then sit down together and discuss the results. That's the important bit. That's the bit where you don't get the trigger, Ben. Here's something. If a trigger is the reason why you want to actually have this conversation, don't let the trigger be the argument. Let the trigger go, okay, let's actually put a plan in place. Let's put some action in place, and let's review the action to see where we can get some wins here, Ben.
This is a really important one. Like, again, whether you're using our app or another budgeting tool or whatever you're doing, it's surprising when people start to see where the money's going, just how informative that is. And the data is the data. Like, ultimately, if you're recording the last 3 months or 6 months or whatever, that's what you've spent. So it's not debatable. It's like, that's what has been spent. And then hopefully that can, you can think about that from a behavioural point of view around decisions and the consequences of how that money is showing up. So that's going to be a critical conversation if we're able to, reboot our money habits.
Number 1, start a conversation. Number 2, understand what money means to you. Number 3, know what you spend. Number 4 is set boundaries. So work out how you'll share these expenses, but accept that there may be some matters you never agree on, Ben. So that's an important part to go. We've got to find common ground, but there are some that you may never agree on, because what you want to do is you want to set up to win. How do we set up to win? And that comes from the flags that you swim between. So number 4 is set boundaries. And number 5 is consider professional help. Don't wait for a full-blown financial crisis to get help. In my experience, been in conversations I've had in my own relationship, often the breakdowns occur because of the incremental 1%ers. So if you think about anyone, I'm not experienced in a marriage breakup, Ben, but the people that I talk to say, quite often it wasn't this big bang argument that they had at the end. It was just the incremental compounding of little 1%ers along the way. And then they reach a point where the straw breaks the camel's back, where they go, click, that's enough. That body of work over a long period of time is, I just don't want to do that anymore. And so my experience in seeing where the trauma exists in relationships around finances is the little minor argument here, the little minor argument there, the disagreement, the look, the poor energy, whatever it is that's built up these little incremental things over time, then arrive at a moment where click, just that one little straw breaks and they go, that's it, I'm done, we're out of here. And so I guess this is saying, well, if that is what the evidence is, not for everyone, but for a lot of people, it's not a big bang argument. It's that compounding over time. Well, get in front of it. Get some help. Ask some people to counsel you through that, because there are many relationship counselling services available and at a low cost too.
Yeah, look, I mean, and if you're getting counselling services, that's you also want to potentially get professional financial advice at the very start, because that lines you up. I mean, it's like anything. A relationship needs effort and input and two-way conversation to keep it, healthy. Your investments and your money management needs input and observation to keep it healthy. So if you don't know how to, a framework or how to start on that, then obviously, that's why there are these tools out there to do that. And also these professionals, from accountants to financial planners to money managers and money coaches and all of those types of people. They're out there, and financial counsellors, if the situation is a little dire, they're also available to you. But that's an investment you need to put in to get out. And so that's a message, around just relationships in general.
One of the joys that we get professionally, Ben, is talking to clients who get on the same page. They bring their bucket list, they have a plan, they know what to do, they execute on it, they've got boundaries, they've got flags to swim between. So it takes the stress and the mystery out of money, and it brings two different norms together to go, okay, here's the goal that we're chasing for. So that feedback we get when people say, hey, listen, we don't fight about money in the household anymore, is just a real joy. So we clearly think that our solution is the best solution.
We're biased.
We're biased, and you wouldn't think otherwise. But the point here is get a solution, whatever that solution is for you. If ours doesn't work for you, go and find another one that actually does work for you. But that making the invisible visible, get the clarity between the two life partners that are doing life together and walking down the same path, and removing the decision fatigue that comes from that stuff, frees you up to plan into your relationship, plan into your children, plan into your business, plan into whatever it is that you've got other things going on. So a bit of a longer Mindset Minute theme today, Ben, but I thought it was really good because we are in the shadows of Christmas. We are about to knock off on our formal format for the podcast. So it's the last one I'll do until we get back from the summer series. And I thought, let's just have this linger in people's minds as they go towards one of the most expensive, most stressful, but also hopefully most relaxing time of the year. for folks as they make sure that they don't become part of the 20%, because money creates relationship problems for 1 in 5 people, Ben.
Well, and especially in a very changing environment with interest rates and cost of living and all of those things that come into that. The decisions around, trade-offs and making judgment calls on essential and discretionary spending over this time are difficult ones, especially, when we're all gainfully employed and we're feeling pretty good, but the winds of change are certainly in the air. So I think it's a timely reminder. So, to Relationships Australia in terms of their insights and so forth, it's an important one.
All right, so we're going to rip into today's show. We talked it at the top that it's we think it might be one of the most beneficial episodes of the entire year, Ben. Perhaps one of the top 5 within our catalogue. If you grasp the concepts that we're about to talk about today, because we over the journey get a lot of people asking the question: I can see if I look in the rear vision mirror, Ben, that property values have gone up in value. But as I look through the windscreen of life, with the rear vision mirror in slight view there, I feel confident about why it happened in the past, but I don't feel, Ben, that it's going to continue to go up in the future. So we want to address that today. And the topic of today's podcast is around, will property values continue to go up, Ben? This is a big one because it is the fundamental uncertainty that unnerves a lot of people between taking action and doing nothing, because surely it can't go up again in the future, Ben. Surely not.
Yeah, I mean, it is by far the most common fear element that's restricting people from indecision and procrastination. So the framework that we're trying to unpack today has a proven sort of theory and evidence, so that it's evidence-backed. If we think about what we're about to talk about here today, and you put in this framework and you look at cities around the world and locations around the world where there is very high property values, there are these things that show up. There are the things that we're about to talk about that absolutely show up. And if you think about how value's created in general and where it's ultimately stored, it also shows up. There's a great saying there from Benjamin Graham, isn't there, Bryce?
There is. So we are going to riff that off, Ben, shortly. But the important part here is, in the first 20 episodes, we talked about this. And so this is really an extension and an evolution of that. But I want to give people an insight into how we arrived to today, Ben. Our publisher has encouraged us to update the Armchair Guide to Property Investing. And so we are going through the process of reliving what we wrote back in 2016. And the good news is that 85% of that book will translate into the updated one with some fresh stories and some fresh energy around the same core concepts that we've tested here. But there is a concept that's been rattling around in your head around the human behaviour, human interest, and economic activity. And so I want to set this up because you and I have been riffing this for a little while, and then you just said, look, Bryce, I've got this stuff rattling around in my head, and let me show you. And so we went through and we digital whiteboarded it for those people who know Miro. And some of the stuff that was popping out of your brain was incredible. So really what today is, I got a front row seat to see what the inner workings of what was going on in Ben's brain, which is incredible. We want you to have an opportunity to see that as well. And in full disclosure, we want to write a chapter in the book around these concepts. So we're practicing today, Ben.
We are, absolutely.
Sharing the concepts to our audience, see if they resonate with the concept so that we can fine-tune and make it the most succinct message within the chapter of that upcoming book. So stay tuned, folks. That book will be out next year. We are working towards that. But to your point, Ben, the father of value investing, Benjamin Graham, explained a concept. He talked about weighing machine and voting machine, and he explained this concept by saying that in the short run, the market is like a voting machine, tallying up which firms are popular and unpopular. But in the long run, the market is like a weighing machine, assessing the substance of a company. Obviously referring to the share market. We want that to be the underlying principle that we want to talk to today. Property is a voting machine in the short term and a weighing machine in the long term. And we're going to unpack that. But his message was clear. What matters in the long run is a company's actual underlying business performance and not the investing public's fickle opinion about its prospects in the short run. Over the long term, when companies perform well, their shares will do so too. And when a company's business suffers, the stock will also suffer. So property values operate in a similar way over short and long-term periods. But the question is, why is this? And we're going to examine that in this episode, Ben.
Yeah, so thanks, Bryce, for the intro. I mean, it's really about sort of saying, slow thinking around this idea of what drives value in the short term and what has value sustained over the long term. So when you're thinking about this, you want to be asking yourself some critical questions about how you then bring your thesis together. And so if we're talking about in the short term, price movements, we're going to be talking about demand and supply. So that, we've been really clear about that, and we'll do some more on that. But in the long term, if we're talking about how you sustain that long-term price movement, you're going to have to ask yourself a question. So back to the weighing machine versus the voting machine. So sentiment and immediate activity is what's driving demand, and that pushes property prices up, just as it does put share prices up in businesses. But they're ultimately judged on whether they can sustain their value. Now, what's interesting about the property market is that there needs to be several key components, which we're going to unpack to you today, that need to be present to continue that sustained growth story. So how I'm going to unpack this is I'm going to start with, the short-term price movement. So we're really clear that it does move by demand and supply, and it's a reliable measure in the short term, but it's not a reliable measure in the long term. So we're just going to spend a couple of minutes in just talking about why that might be. Now, the most logical one is probably affordability. People will look at affordability and they'll go, well, that's why, because effectively everyone couldn't afford to go there. And so that's why property prices slowed down, or, the market found an equilibrium. Now, that's not entirely true, because in some aspects, affordability is also a judgment around what I can afford to buy and where I want to live. And so in some cases, it may be unavoidable to buy in that location, but very affordable to buy in some regional town in the middle of nowhere. And so you've got to judge affordability based on still this underlying driver of human interest and human behavior in terms of what is getting in there. So when you hear the market commentators talk about, and we're getting to affordability constraints, that is potentially true, but the element of that is I've still got to make a judgment call about the type of product that I buy and where I buy it. And so that's referred to as the substitution effect from an economical point of view. And so that's when people might downgrade from a house to a townhouse, or they might downgrade their location, or they might downgrade quality. All of those things come into the assessment of affordability. But the other interesting things here is, and this is what we wanted to lean into, there is irrational behavior, right? So we do see in the short term, demand is still led by irrational behavior. And that's when we get effectively bubbles in particular marketplace. So that, if you think about the share market, GameStop would be a classic example of that recently, in terms of, all of the individual retail investors just slammed the market, told this big story. Everyone believed the story, and the price went to, $500, and then completely collapsed under no fundamental. So there's a classic case, voting machine versus the fundamental, ultimately weighing machine. And Bryce, we saw a recent example on the Block series, that we can probably talk to as well.
Yeah, well, to quote the irrational behavior, there was someone who was prepared to pay an extraordinary amount of money for one of them, but not the others, right? But there is the block effect, there's the magic dust effect that comes from that as well. And equally on the flip side of that, you get someone who says, well, I don't want to pay an extraordinary amount of money for a couple of people who've never done this before having a swing, right? So there comes a point of inflection where the block price, in my view, the block price works, and then the block price doesn't work. But you've got blocks, you've got fear of missing out, you've got short-term speculation. These are all things that have impact on that short-term demand, which might not necessarily give you an indication of how that particular property, that particular suburb, that particular location will perform over a period of time. It is a classic underlying principle that Benjamin Graham was saying. In its short term, it is a voting system. It's a pop culture thing. It's a popularity thing. But over the journey, will that be part of it? The pandemic also did a little bit of that, Ben, where people are going, right, packing my bags, I'm out of here, I'm heading to the hills. And some of those regional locations have sustainable underlying factors, and some of them don't. And so people will have, spikes in prices in those demands. So, but the point you're making here is, why isn't demand and supply a reliable or consistent measure of long-term growth? Well, there's two reasons. It's that affordability sentiment and also irrational behaviour.
Yeah, because we can justify paying a certain price because just recently a couple of other people bought similar types of properties for the similar type of price, or it's totally irrational where, I have another interest, or I've got more money than sense, or whatever that may look like. So we're sort of talking about that. But here's what we're trying to do. So the final point we're making here is this one here around fluctuating economic activity. You're going to hear us talk a lot in this episode about economic activity, but it's very, very clear that you can find marketplaces where demand is out of whack with supply. In other words, there has been periods where these areas have very, very strong price growth. But then after, whether it's affordability, whether it's irrational behavior starts to become practical or sensible behavior, or the fundamentals don't support its ongoing benefit to justify its value. So we talk about this in terms of examples of towns or cities and their economic performance and how they continue to grow, because we do know that there are examples of townships, even in Australia, regional towns that are dying or completely die off. Or there's examples of cities which were, probably the Rust Belt in America is a great example of cities that have completely collapsed in on themselves because ultimately the product and the economic activity that they did in terms of Detroit's a good example of that. It was the car manufacturing mecca of the world. Everyone was buying cars in the 50s, 60s and 70s. And then it collapsed on itself because ultimately the economic advantage that they had was no longer that case, and they didn't reinvest. And so Detroit during the GFC, you could buy a house or maybe even 5 houses on your credit card. Now, we've got an example here that we wanted to share around Broken Hill in Australia. Now, Broken Hill was a mining town area in New South Wales. BHP owned the mine out there. And during a period, it had incredible prosperity, in terms of the local town, people going there, job opportunities and so forth. So we did a little bit of research and we found a really old Value of Generals PDF document dating back to
dinosaur edition.
It's a dinosaur document, this one. But in 1976, Bryce, we have prices for Broken Hill. Now, in the west area of Broken Hill, we have $33,000 the median price, and in the southwest area of Broken Hill, we have house prices of $20,000. Now, we don't have the connection from 1976 right through to 1990, but from 1990, we also now do have that data of the median price in Broken Hill. So when we correlate that out and we look at, okay, we know that the mine fell over and the township effectively died off in a way, but we've seen since 1976 to August of 2022, the median house price has gone from around $27,500 to $170,600. Now, that's a long-term annual capital growth return of 4.07%. Now, in the recent uplift of economic activity that was happening across Australia, the prices have spiked in the last couple of years. And people might think, it's moved from like 120 to 160,000. So that's a massive return in the short term. That's an example of what you'll see in terms of short-term behavior and demand and supply. Now, again, if we have the data from basically their late 60s to early 70s, we would have seen an incredible spike of property prices in that area because demand, the economy, the mining town was booming. And we've got examples that in Castlemaine and some of these other centres that effectively were bustling city centres right in the heart of activity of the 1800s and effectively have died off and have had to reinvent themselves into other types of things. But you're seeing these beautiful homes that were built in those areas, the beautiful features and amenities, the councils, buildings, and all of those types, all beautiful stuff because there was heaps of money back in the time when all of that was happening. But effectively, the economic activity in that centre died off, and effectively the property prices of that location also didn't materialise or suffered considerably. And Bryce, you've got another example of that.
Well, you can see from the Broken Hill that people can't see it on a podcast, but the trend goes sideways, does a little spike, and then it goes sideways for another long period of time, and then it does a little spike. It's not that general upward trend with the volatility. So that's an important point. And obviously Gladstone's the other example too, Ben. There was a whole range of flat growth for some time. It became a very interesting focus back in the sort of post GFC. Everyone was jumping in there a little earlier as well. You could see some big spikes during that time. Everyone was jumping in. But the important point, and the thing that you and I were chatting about, is that market is now, not a great news story for folks. And over the journey, the growth rate is back to a lower amount at 5.5%, Ben. But the important thing here, and you'll see through the evolution of this episode, is the money being raised in some of these locations. The money is actually flowing back to the bigger hubs of Melbourne and Sydney, because the invoices are being raised out of offices in those big cities. They're not being raised out of these towns where they're actually getting access to these resources and these minerals, right? So again, over time, not too dissimilar to the Broken Hill message. You got the same message here in Gladstone, using that as an example. And we know lots of people who have invested in that market and had their pants pulled down. So that's another example of that short-term fluctuation.
It's a sad story, right? But it's an example of, if you had have looked at the demand supply score or ratio in 2002, 2003, 2004, it would have been off the Richter scale in terms of the demand was so strong. Property prices were accelerating enormously from $100,000 up to $400,000 over effectively like an 8-year period, right? That was that sort of mining boom time. And everyone was saying, look at the infrastructure that's going in there, look at the economic activity that's happening in that particular. And now if you had bought at the peak of that market in 400,000 in 2009, you would have also seen here that it then peaked at around 450 in 2012, 2013. But today, the median now sits at around that sort of 305,000. So if you bought in those particular times, you're going to be potentially waiting another 5 or 6 or 7 years. And it may not even get to that level, because effectively after the initial gas boom and all of the other stuff that was happening and the port redevelopment and all of that type of stuff, those workers have left and we're out of that particular market. So it's just a reminder to sort of say, did economic activity sustain the property prices in that area? The answer to that is definitely no. And that's what you've got to be careful of when you're starting to look at those types of things. So that sort of summarizes, if we think about that, a couple of things you need to consider. Affordability and sentiment is obviously going to bring you back to equilibrium in the short term. Irrational behavior is going to bring you back to equilibrium in the short term. And that over-exuberance could see you paying more and potentially seeing red ink when it comes to the values of your property. And then finally, we're talking here about, economic fluctuation. So economic activity in that particular area, how quickly is it growing and how much can it allow to drive?
And in terms of what drives the demand, that's human interest, human behavior, and also people's capacity to buy. We've spent a catalogue of the journey talking to those 2 points there. But largely that's why we think that's the underlying thesis of why in the short term it can be a voting machine rather than a weighing machine. So we want to pivot to long-term sustained price growth. We want to answer the question that is rattling around in someone's mind. Sure, but if I'm going to buy something in 2022, if I plan to buy something in 2023, or if they're listening to this in 2024, Ben, or in the future, can I have some confidence that despite all that weight of evidence in history, is there any reasonableness to the thesis, to the argument that prices will continue to grow in value? So we want to unpack that and give some people some frameworks for them to form their own opinion on whether or not that is going to happen. Because our opinion, Ben, is optimistic, and quite often people go, sure, that's great for you guys.
Yeah.
But if they get a framework and a way that they can filter the information through to make their own judgment about whether or not they should have any faith in the next decade, 2 decades, 3 decades around price growth, that's the goal of the podcast here.
It is, and I'm going to tell a little story, Bryce, as a bit of a scene setter, because I think it's important. I mean, again, this is one of our fundamental episodes, right? So when the first fleet first arrived into terra firma Australia, as we call it, now obviously the Indigenous people, our First Nations people, they understood the true value of the land in which they lived on, right? So, but as set aside for that, in terms of Western society, we run economies, we run societies, and we build off that. Now, when that first fleet arrived, the land value across Australia was effectively nil, right? Now, you're going to be able to argue that there are some productive use and certain areas where you can potentially grow vegetables and those types of things. So, but this is the mindset that I want you to have when we start thinking about this, because it's through that economic activity that's actually installed the predominant store of value in land, okay, which is a perfect little segue, because if we think about it as like, Mossman, Bellevue Hill, Point Piper, all the different locations, Toorak, all of the really rich locations around Australia have been built on the back of this understanding. So that's the message here in terms of it was roughly equal, but we want to talk about land as being where the predominant value is stored and ultimately sustained, because how we judge that is through three ways. So land value judge and grows in three different ways. And the first way we want to talk about is the productive use. So we want you to understand that when you think about land and from an economic principle, value is judged on its productivity. It's its output. What can it actually be to be used? So, and that's in fundamental economics, but it's also true when it comes to residential land. So the first is the fundamental of the productive use of that land. So let's step through the 7 different types of land that we know is available in this country. And let's start to talk about that, Bryce, in regards to how it's valued.
So we'll go from least valued to the most highly prized. But number one is the desert, right? So very low rainfall, virtually zero productive use. So therefore, whilst there's a lot out there, it has low value given the fact that that productive use is limited very much. Although, Ben, I did see a documentary on ABC, the Australian story about a guy who started a concert out in the middle of the desert. So it gets productivity for about 3 or 4 days, and it's a really clever and unique way, and it's worth checking out. But generally speaking, Ben, because of its distance and its remoteness and the fact that you can't get infrastructure and you can't get services, that productive use from an economic sense has very low value.
And interestingly, with that example, he would have taken that profit and put it back into the centre where he lives, because there's no economic activity that's happening out there that he hasn't created, and there's potentially that's only temporary infrastructure. So that's a good segue into our second piece. But then the next one is semi-arid land, right? So what we're talking about here is potentially, and there's a lot of this country. So you see the outback wranglers, and you see all of the, huge cattle farmers, and this is where the camels and the wild donkeys and all that roam. That is effectively semi-arid land, right? So it's really only effective use over vast, spaces of land is Western Australia, Northern Territory, and parts of those lands. So it has an extremely low per acre price. But because there's so much of it, you hear about these, mega cattle farms and all that exchanging in the tens of millions or all that area. But that's because they're running, hundreds of thousands of head of cattle around that area. But in terms of that, that's effectively that's only productive use. So if you think about the yield that you're getting from that land, it's actually very low. You need a lot of that land because you're yielding very low output from that particular thing. So that's semi-arid land. The next one.
It's broad acre farming land. So you think large scale grains and crops, you've got big sheep and cattle grazing there. So it is higher yielding land. So it's increasing the productivity. Therefore, it has that flow on increase in the land value. So you can see starting to go from desert at one, but then slowly moving to a point where the productive use of this land at a big scale in this broad acre farming land still starts to increase the value of that land based on the increased activity from a commercial economic activity from farmers that are able to utilise that land.
And then if you step one step in again, you've got high intensity farming. So this is where, they're smaller land sizes, but the yielding is so much more productive. So the outputs are usually more. So the economic value that they create in each harvest over each year or 2 cycles or whatever that looks like, that's obviously creating revenue. That revenue is then judged as the yield and the production of that land. And so naturally, that high intensity farming land, which is usually also starting to be located in areas where they're capturing that economic value. So you start to think about dairy, you start to think about high intensity cattle farming, you start to think about chook pens and all of that type of stuff. They are usually located because obviously the goods need to be transported for effectively quick use as opposed to the grain. You know, that sort of broad acre farming, you can store the grain, stays for a longer period of time. And so ultimately that land value is judged at a higher price point. So that's really the rural area. Now we start to tip into more of the lifestyle elements and the productive use when it comes to not just necessarily primary production land, but starting to think about the land in a lifestyle sense, starting to think about the land in terms of how it allows me to produce on that land, but also what living standards and dwellings can I potentially put on there.
Yeah, so number 5 is the rural hobby lots. So we're getting closer to those trading centres. The plots are getting smaller because, interestingly, Ben, the value of the land is getting more expensive. So therefore, being able to hold these properties at large scale becomes more difficult. But because they're rural still, but they are hobby, you are bringing it, to your point, they're getting closer to that lifestyle feel. So it could be small commercial operations that are turning a profit that allow them to use that land not only for the lifestyle that it provides to live, but it also allows them to turn that land.
Yeah, a little bit of a gisting that's going on and, maybe small crops of things that they're sort of doing there, that type of thing. But it is sort of saying that these lots can be maybe 20, 25 acres. And it is about a lifestyle choice and people going out there. So they may have made their money in a major centre and, it's a transition sort of lifestyle. But the next
tourist market coming through, sampling some of their product,
exactly,
sampling some of the lifestyle.
From what do they say, from paddock to plate and all of that type. That's the sort of thing. Then we go into the next one, which is the lifestyle lots. Now, these are definitely closer to the commutable centres, to the trading centres. So we're going to think about that in more. So what we're judging here is commute times, lifestyle aspects, don't want to have any neighbours too close to them. So you're talking about these acre lots, these 5 acre lots, but they are on the city fringes as we start to get closer to that. So they have a lot of appeal for that privacy and that individualization and those types of things as well. And again, because there's not a lot of them, there is a scarcity element to those, which is obviously yielding a higher price point. So when you see those estates that are being built where you might have, say, 30 lots of 1 acres, they have a lot of appeal because effectively those people are moving in there feel a little bit more like there's a status element to those in terms of those, but they still have access to those big trading centres and those big commerce centres.
And then number 7, we bring it into residential lots, broken up into single dwellings, multiple, townhouses, medium density and high density, which most of us are exposed to, most of us are used to. And for anyone who remembers last week's episode, making home deposits made simple, it's the hardest for a lot of us to get into in the first place. And it's because that is the highest, most productive use of the land because it is closest to everything that makes our life tick. The human interest component, the human behaviour component, and the economic activity component. So we've really just defined those productive uses, starting at desert, moving to semi-arid land, moving to broadacre farming land, then into high-intensity farming, rural hobby lots, into lifestyle lots, and now into residential lots.
And Bryce, don't mistake the idea that you can continually keep reproducing the productivity out of that, but you can in some degrees. Let me explain this. So single lots can turn into double lots, which means the cost per square metre of land. The person who's turning apple into apple pie, we often refer to it. So those lots for those people who are manufacturing that are attempting to get the profitability and the yield out of that land. And then what we see in terms of, we've got obviously greenfield subdivisions, which is the first lots we're talking about. But when you get into the inner city areas and you get really close to those trading centres, those big centres of economic activity, the zoning regulations do allow for a repurpose of that. I mean, I drive home every day through Kensington, and I can tell you, Bryce, that there's buildings that were built in maybe the 50s and 60s. They're all getting knocked down, and they're going to, because of the rezoning that's happened in that whole area, is going to be more density, and obviously there's profitability for those developers who are doing that type of thing. So it's a classic case of, don't mistake that for, oh, well, I'm going to buy one of the apartments in that area because the land's worth a lot. No, your land to asset ratio value is really poor, and your productive use has been fully extracted. So
arguably
you're not going to.
The juice has been squeezed.
The juice has been squeezed. So you're not ultimately going to be in a position where there's great return for you. Great return for the developer who's potentially done that. And it's made that land worth more, because also, coming back to that point, when you build those big infrastructure and commerce centres, you're also going to build the lifestyle elements and the follow through, which is a nice little segue in what we're going to talk about in the not too distant future. So it just gives you some idea, but that's the productive use. So again, land value is judged and grows in three ways: on a sustainable basis, on its productive use, and its repurposing, and ultimately, it's a rebirthed into those types of things. And as their population grows, we see some of those lifestyle lots turn into subdividable green areas. We see the rural lobby lots potentially then becoming lifestyle lots, and those lifestyle lots over 20 or 30 or 50 years then turn into initial residential lots. You see the cycle of life that's going on with the productive use of land, and that's what helps store some of its value in that particular aspect.
Ben, you said land is valued, land value is judged in three ways. That first way is productive use. The second way is on the land's location, so its exclusivity and its desirability, and this is built on the back of human behaviour. So one of the great things about this country, Ben, is the lack of class system that you can see, for example, in the motherland, around all the aristocracy that comes usually divided. The central dividing line is for people who own the land and the people who don't own the land. And that is the I guess the fundamentals that underpins our country, which underpins the great Australian dream, where we have our chance to get our property rights, put our stake in the ground, and have our own ownership. And I guess as our country gets older and the access to being able to afford property gets a little harder, with that deposit hurdle being a challenge, we will start to see more and more of that social class creep in based on property ownership over the next 50 and 100 years. But to this point here around human behaviour, it is a social class and a social status thing. And it is the easiest way to judge success. People drive up and down their street and they compare themselves to what other people have got, largely based on the amount of money that is invested back into the land, that comes from the form of, for a lot of people, from the housing that's on that. But for a lot of cases, it's the size of the land, the views that you get from the land, the position in the street that you have. And it helps people judge success and how you show off people's wealth. So you go, okay, what's the productive use? But the second thing is a status test. It's the thumbs under the armpits with the fingers sort of on the suspenders. It's like, what do people think about me and how I, based on driving up in my street, based on the suburb I live in, and based on what they see from my house?
Yeah, and I think we need to understand that, and a lot of commentators and people who are ill-informed in this space might sort of put some commentary out there about always thinking that people are going to have to borrow money to buy property, and ultimately, how do they afford it? But what they don't understand is that potentially there is generational wealth. There is all this other wealth that they may have been able to capture and store, and with the power of compounding, that's absolutely real. Now, in a technical economic sense, there's this concept that goes against the traditional demand equation, right? So the demand equation is one where, as prices rise, the economic argument is there's a substitution effect. And that substitution effect means I'll go and buy something else that gives me the equivalent satisfaction and so forth. But there is economic theory that also talks about what's called the Veblen effect. Now, the Veblen effect is irrespective of price. If I want it, I'm going to buy it. And in fact, the actual price, the higher the price goes, the more desirable it gets for me. And so there is some really interesting research in this area around what's called the Veblen social psychological model. States that consumers' social and cultural backgrounds are important determinants in their buyer behaviour. Now, according to the professor who put this together, Professor Veblen, consumer purchases are driven primarily by their need to maintain a social class and prestige rather than intrinsic need. Now, there are 6 important factors in this model: social class, level of income, which we're going to double click on in a minute, culture, subculture, family, and the reference group. So if my reference group is keeping up with the Joneses, and that's the tribe that I want to associate with or relate to, that is an incredibly powerful instrument in terms of buyer behavior. Now, one might argue that's irrational. Oh yeah, that's because we're humans. We're not econs, we're actually humans. And if I've got $30 million and I want to buy a $5 million mansion and drop $10 million in renovating it because I want to have cocktail parties, and so that is my right. That is, no one can stop me. It's a free country to do all that type of stuff. And this is the type of cycle that occurs in terms of that. And in theory, what you've got to also remember is that's actually helpful in respect of the ripple effect of affordability and prices for the rest of us, for the mere mortals of of society as well. And those types of things really play into that particular story. So we summarize that in terms of what we're talking about when we are talking about this particular idea is human behavior relating to social class and status, how society judges success. We see these influencers, we see these shows of people buying these mega properties, we see all of this. It's just reinforced into us constantly that success is judged through wealth, right? And status and lifestyle. So that is not going to change anytime soon. So you've got to understand that. And then ultimately what I was mentioning before is if these people inherit 20 million, and remember, we've got over $3 trillion of wealth that's going to be transferred from the baby boomers into Gen X and Gen Y over the course of the next 2 to 3 decades. That is how they show off their wealth. Now, that might be in the cars that they buy, but a lot of it is in the properties that they own. Remembering, property, as investors, we should be price takers, not price makers. 70% of the marketplace is owned by owner-occupiers. This is the human interest and human behavior story. And in terms of, the quality properties, the character and charm, it's what it means to me. It's how it makes me feel. And ultimately, we don't expect that to change. And if we think about, our Asian communities and so forth, they're very, very big on brands. They're very big on status. Bernard Salt talked about, you made a big decision to relocate from another country and you're coming to Australia and you're migrating here. And we're talking about this whole concept of, I want to show success. So I'm going to have that 2-story home and the nice new car out in front because that's the lifestyle I'm afforded to because I can earn higher incomes in a city, in a country like Australia. That is all playing in to that. So we've sort of made up a little bit of a list here to think about how we might classify the Bryce. Do you want to go through them?
Well, this helps with the irrational, like the theory. Yeah, that is a bit irrational, but there's a hell of a lot of sustainability about that irrationality too, because social class layers are this: uber rich are billionaires, the mega rich measure in the hundreds of millions, the rich are under 100 million, the wealthy identify between net worth 5 and 10 million. The financially free are somewhere between 2 and 5 million, and the self-funded retirees are 1 to 2. And within each of those categories, people can afford different style properties. But if you go back to uber rich, mega rich, rich, and even the wealthy men, generally speaking, the decisions that they get to make around their homes, around their houses, around how they store the value into the land can be a little irrational, but it does have sustainability over the long term, which is why these mega rich locations have the underpinning, because there's a small niche of people around the world. There is mobility around the decisions they make for these niche locations. So one drops out, two is ready to take their spot in a heartbeat. So I guess that explains why some of the store of the value in the land is determined by the status test based on the resources that people have, depending on which category they can identify with.
Correct. And us mere mortals, we do look at and judge the land value, because at the end of the day, value is the trust and the perceived mechanism of exchange. And we're sort of saying, well, if that property up the street just sold for $2.5 million, and that's the benchmark because of the land size and the character and charm of the home, well, my property, I can see 1.2 million in my property. So that's the trigger in terms of understanding of how we judge that. And we've got to remember that the vast majority of people who buy residential property are not technically trained valuers. They don't look in the fundamental aspects of it. They are trying to process, and that's why they often buy on emotion rather than logic, but that underpins that value. But the final thing, which is, a beautiful segue into the third piece here, is how we judge land value is through the level of localized economic activity. So we've talked about the productivity of land, but this, in my opinion, is really, if there was a weighted means here, this has the vast majority of my weight, at least over 50%, if not of the three. This is where it matters. This is ultimately, you show me a city around the world where there's an enormous amount of economic activity, and I'll show you high prices. So that's what we want to be talking about in terms of this point. So economic productivity is long-term causation. So it's not correlation, it's absolutely causation. And this is how we mean, because it's the creator of the money and the income generated in that particular cluster. It's the size of the society that it builds, and it's the wealth that it creates and the distribution of that wealth amongst its people. So when we do think about that, it ultimately underpins everything about sustained demand for the land. And as I said before, it is the causation of land value growth over not the short term, but over the long term. And this is, again,
that's a double click, underline, bold, in italics. That is, it is the reason for the value, not a response to the value, Ben. I think, you've used the word causation. I think we should pause. That is the central word to the argument that you're about to mount.
It is, and it makes really good sense when we build the economic flywheel concept, that is how societies and towns and then eventually cities are created. And if we think about that, here's how we think about it, right? So at some point in time when people, arrived in Sydney Harbour, or they arrived into the port of Melbourne, and they created a little trading centre where people started to trade goods. And if you think about that sort of little trading centre where people were going and the farmers were exchanging their goods for money, or in case of Australia, maybe a little bit of gold at that time. And ultimately that trading centre then becomes a little settlement. Yeah. And, so because obviously there's commerce occurring in that trading centre, that little settlement starts to get built. And around that little settlement, well, if there's people here and they're going to permanently reside here, well, they're going to need food and accommodation. They're going to need food, they're going to need short-term accommodation and longer-term residency accommodation. And that creates further demand for other industries. And ultimately, here's where the flywheel creates itself. And so what you're talking about here, that creates the demand for essential services. So if this is now becoming a town, we need to ratify that town. And so we need a town planner, we need an infrastructure, we need health services, we need education centres, public and commercial infrastructure assets, we need legal and law enforcement, we need transport, land zoning, releases, civil works. Now that creates all of those things. So all of a sudden, a settlement turns into a little town, and then a town turns into a city, and then a city turns into a mega city, depending on the amount of economic activity that you can do in that particular location. Now, through all of that, there's also, we don't always just work, right? We ultimately need some lifestyle pieces there. So lifestyles created, cultural exchange, cultural exchanges, interests and activities, and those hobbies are formed. So we want parks, we want town planning, we want all of those things. And that flywheel starts to turn, the cog starts to turn, and it just starts spinning off jobs, more jobs, income, more income. And then ultimately it's competition for talent of that, that human capital. And then if you are lucky enough, you'll ultimately realize that you'll get to a significant city. And the biggest cities in the world are the cities that operate commerce. So yes, that's trading centers and rural towns and all of that, where they might exchange, the small farmers' wheat and so forth. That's true. But we're talking about cities where the mega deals are done. So take Bryce's point about Gladstone before. Yep, the gas and the coal are all being exported out of there, but the invoice and the deal was negotiated in Singapore or Melbourne or Tokyo or Sydney, and ultimately then there's the mergers and acquisitions. So we've always said this. If you listen to all of our podcasts, the biggest currency, the biggest commodity in the world is actually money itself, right? The exchange of money. And so the big four accounting firms, they come in and they do some audits, but then they put deals together, and the mergers and acquisitions and the VC companies. There are billions and billions of dollars of transactions that are exchanging in those big commercial centers, and they need human capital to do that. And that human capital are significantly rewarded for that effort. And so they are taking home very, very big paychecks as part of that. But that's the cycle of how economic activity builds and how we build these mega cities. And I said it to you earlier, if you show me a city that's a mega city, that's a center of commerce, I'll show you silly prices of property.
That is a fact, Ben. And we can't solve the problem of which came first out of the chicken or the egg, but I think we've now solved the problem of, out of our three pillars, Ben, of human interest, human behavior, and economic activity, which one is the one that comes first, because the other two are a byproduct of the economic activity. And you just talked to that point with an incredible amount of passion. And folks, this is the bit where I was saying we've got to do this on the podcast so we can hear how this guy's brain has been ticking, and we've been riffing it for the last few weeks on this. But it's important to understand that, because if that when someone is only had their only experience born out of the real estate in this country, Ben, and then you go to those mega cities that you speak of, and we now get exposed to those prices through some of the television shows that show us high end, not only in this country but around the world. And you see some of those prices that really do blow your hair back. And as a comparison to us and the income that we're earning, we think, how is that even possible? But it's not until you go into those cities and unpack what you just said, and then get a better sense of around what is the baseline income that you're experiencing in that city in comparison to the city that you're making the reference on, that in part way explains how you are able to get real estate prices at that level, because the economic activity within that particular city is humming at such a cadence that it can support more people at scale, which we'll go into in a shortly about the number, but more people at scale who have a higher income, who then can prop up and put that into the land in that city that they're buying in, so that gets recycles and reaffirms the point that we're making here.
And it taps into the human interest and human behavior story around too, right? Like, because they want convenience, they want proximity, they want all of the amenity, and the more you build that amenity, and the more and the businesses want their money. So the dress shops, the coffee shops, the bars, the great restaurants, the wine bars and all of that, they start to show up in these high income areas. So it's, again, a little flywheel within the big flywheel in terms of that's, so it's like, wow, I've got everything here. And the private schools start to turn up because there's money there, to be able to generate. So again, it's just this economic cycle. So the message here is always around the activity that happens in those bigger centres is going to be critical for sustained long-term growth. Now, before we then go into the key takeaways, I just want to summarise this point, and that is that this is plausible for our bigger economic centres, right? So every capital city in the country has an economic flywheel, and that economic flywheel is going to be important for its longer-term price growth. And if affordability does become a thing, there is going to be that substitution effect where some people will tap out and they will move to another city, and they will, although move to a regional area or whatever that may be. But if the economic engine of those bigger cities continues to fire, then ultimately There's going to be new people arriving to take on those jobs, to challenge themselves, to basically be as successful as they can be. And that is basically the flywheel of a capitalist system in terms of how that works. And so that's an important message here. We're not sort of saying that this is not possible in some regional towns, satellite towns, but those other towns, their values are really, in terms of long term. In the short term, those values can be that short-term sentiment that we've talked about. But in the long term, it's going to be ultimately weighed over 30, 40, 50 years based on the economic activity that can generate. So yes, you're going to have, times of 5 years of really great spikes in property prices, and then you may have periods that are void of that expanse or that growth story because it's not sustained and the economic activity wasn't generated in that particular area. So there will be judgment on that. So that's why, and this is probably why I gabble on so much about the politics, Bryce, because the politicians have really got one great job to do, and that is grow the economy. And if they grow the economy, there's more to share there. And that's why I'm so passionate about when they make dumb economic decisions, because it affects the flywheel in every state and city and centre that they work in, whether that be local councils making dumb decisions about not getting new investment in there, right through to state parliament, right through to federal politics in terms of the economy is so important in terms of that economic driver, which is a good segue into the key takeaways, Bryce. So let me see if I can summarize. We promised it was going to be an epic show. We've still got a fair bit to go, but this is important stuff in terms of what it looks like. So let's start with the first one.
So the bigger the economic flywheel gets in that location, the higher land prices get. I think we've built a bit of a case around why that is, Ben, but we've got some stats here that you've unpacked. So it's worth sort of talking to. I guess the segue for me is I remember, Ben, being a Perth boy, with a limited understanding of what was driving property values. I remember when Perth was the second most expensive real estate in the land, second to Sydney, back in the early 2000s. And I remember just thinking, probably even articulating it now around a voting machine, it's like, oh, I can't wait to see if Perth wins. I can't wait to see if Perth wins, because they just roared up the charts. We were always sitting at fourth or fifth position. We're sitting at second. And so I'm thinking it's just, okay, will Perth win? But it's now when you understand the economic flywheel and you understand that Sydney is going to always be a very difficult city to ever knock off the perch based on the fact it's such a large economy that does a lot of trade. Melbourne has the opportunity to do that. But the other cities will, in our lifetime, not be able to knock them off the perch, given the fact that the economic output that exists in those two particular states can be unmatched by the others in the current vision for how those cities work. Now, you talk to the point that we've got this wonderful superpower in this country where we are so incredibly desirable on the world stage to come and live here. That's always our chance. When you talked about the substitution, will I tap out of that market and go and move to one of the other markets where it's more affordable and the lifestyle is different? Yes, that is true. And that's a problem for those departing economies if we're not letting people back in through the top of the funnel into this country. And I think the fact that we've got this wonderful lifestyle, the stability that we have both politically and financially, means that the economies will continue to grow, given the flywheel of people moving creates more services, creates more demand, makes that pie. But I think the important point here is Sydney and Victoria will always be leading the country in its current trajectory based on the data that you've uncovered here.
Yeah, and it's so to give you some idea, we look at things like economic output, we look at things like gross state product, and then we try and look at gross regional product. Now, the gross regional product, we'd like to get some more data in this particular space, but what we're talking about there is the big city centres. So Greater Sydney, just by way of example, its gross regional product is $463 billion. Now, compare that to, we have some data from Darwin, it's $19.1 billion. Okay, so, and to give some context, Perth is $231 billion. Brisbane, $181 billion, Melbourne, $372 billion. Now, if you look at the Greater New South Wales, its economic output is $1.3 trillion. Melbourne is $1.01 trillion. WA 687 billion. I couldn't find the data for Queensland, but it just reinforces the message that when you think macro 30, 50 years, 80, 100 years, if those big centres continue to keep getting bigger, then ultimately their property values will be underpinned by that economic activity. If those cities fail, if those business, for a competitive advantage, they get trounced, the whole society moves in different directions, there's no need for these big centres of commerce, then we'll be wrong in terms of that sustained value. But it's unlikely that you're going to not see, those big four accounting firms and the big commerce centres and the big trading businesses and the big mega companies will usually have headquarters in these major cities because it's all about attracting that talent. So that gives you some context. We're not, and just a pause here. We're not saying that growth won't come to those other areas. That is not what we're saying. I mean, Australia has around 6 to 6.5 is the long-term median growth. So we expect that they will be price takers so long as these other mega cities continue to be price makers. So it's still there's still markets within markets within markets, and there's still unbelievable opportunity in those areas. But we are doing a 30,000-foot overview for you to build confidence in the idea that our property price is going to continue to keep growing. And the reality is it's going to be evidenced on the back of the income growth that's coming to those people in those locations. And that's telling us that story, which is a segue into our second takeaway, Bryce.
Well, the higher the income's paid, the higher the land prices get. So because people have the opportunity to reinvest the amount of money that they have back into the land, back into the status that we talked about before at all levels of property locations. So you have some income stats to sort of back that up.
Yeah, so what I did is I went back and had a look at the median weekly income changes between the census of 2011 compared to the census of 2021. Now, again, we are using data that is synthesized to median, so it doesn't show the long tail of people earning a huge amount of income. And if you did averages, that's the reason why we don't use averages, because there is a long tail there. There could have been maybe 700 people in Melbourne who made over $10 million in income this year. And there might have been, say, 1,200 of them in Sydney. Those numbers are completely made up. But the point I'm making is that let's just have a look at the mean, right? Because what you're looking at here is the mean's going to tell you a story of why the value penetration goes deeper and wider as opposed to, being a shallow valuation in particular pockets of a smaller regional town and so forth. So New South Wales, we saw a variance from $561 median weekly rent in 2011 to increase
median weekly income.
Median weekly income. Thank you. To $813, and so that's an improvement of $252 or 45% over that time. Now compare that to the lowest median weekly income, which is Tasmania. Tasmania had a median weekly income of $499, and that moved to $701. So that increase is a 40% increase. But here's where it matters, all right? Because everyone's thinking, well, that's keeping up. That's pretty good. Where it matters is if you start to then compare the difference. So you've now got median weekly rents in New South Wales of $813, median weekly incomes. I did say rents, didn't I? To Tasmania. So that equates to a separation of 81%. So there's a separation of 81% between what increases have occurred in New South Wales compared to what have occurred in Tasmania. So when I talk about the 81% difference, Bryce, what I'm actually saying is if you think about for Sydney, that went up by $62, the differential between Sydney and Tasmania was $62. In 2021, the differential is $112. So 62 versus 112, that's an 81% difference. So effectively, Sydney's rate of growth is growing 81% more than the rate of growth in Tasmania. And that's what we're talking about in terms of the power of income and the power of borrowing power and purchasing power, and how that then obviously flows down into property prices.
Well, I was also going to say too that people could see this, like where you said we're at 30,000 feet, right? But if people go down to 2,000 feet and they look at the markets that they're in, they can still apply the same logic, right? Because like let's just go to Adelaide, for example, or Perth, or Melbourne and Sydney always get the attention. Those sorts of micro reflections exist there as well, which can then explain, if I'm in Adelaide, why Unley is more expensive than if I go up to far north, up into let's say Elizabeth, or I go into a regional location as well. So you can apply the same sorts of logic within the flywheels of the particular city that you're in, or have it as a reference to where you are, to the nearest city that you've got. So it's not just sort of saying, hey, listen, Melbourne and Sydney are the greatest here and everyone's got the booby prize. That is not true. It's just, to your point on this third one, the greater the number of high income earners, the greater the spread of high land and property prices. That last bit's important. The greater the spread of higher land and property prices, because if you go and have a look at some comparison data, you can see, the census data of how many people have earned more than $2,000 per week. And there's a couple of benchmarks that you can do, 2011 census, 2016 and 2021. If you have a look at the analysis between the change between 2011 over that decade, in New South Wales, there is, from 2011 to 2016, you've gone from 369,000 people to 537,000. So there's about 167,000 change. From the next census to census, it's about 355. But from the breadth of those three censuses, it's not easy to say, is that 2011 to 2021 is 523,000 people, 523,735 to be exact, which represents a 142% increase. Compare that to Tasmania, because we use that as a reference point because it's a smaller population base. Tasmania's gone from 12,200 people over that to, in the same period of time, going to 23,000. So they've done 189% increase. So arguably at a percentage level, you go, well, that's a compelling story.
Yeah.
No, what's important here is don't go the percentages. How much is the actual people, the bodies earning an income who are buying properties, making decisions about where the value is stored in the land? You've got a comparison of an increase of 523,000 in New South Wales to 23,000 in Tasmania. And that's the point of the story here, because we go back to the key takeaway. The greater the number of high income earners, the greater the spread of higher land and property prices. And I think that sort of helps demonstrate that there's more higher income earners in that particular state than there is in Tasmania, hence why you can see a difference in the reflection of the property prices, and to sort of reinforce our point, Ben, around economic activities being the central flywheel that spins off everything that ends up showing up in property value.
Yeah, so there's 32 times more people in New South Wales on higher incomes than what there are in Tasmania. For Northern Territory, it's over 50 times. So, and remember, these are consumers. They're spending, they're investing back in, they're making themselves house proud. They're doing all of those things that you would expect them to do, which is putting more and more momentum into that economic flywheel, but it's also, increasing the values over time. And that's sort of a big part of that particular story. So that's ultimately what we're talking about here in terms of understanding that really prices, again, are set by the economic activity and sustained at that level. But that's also because it's what's driving our incomes, and it's our incomes that ultimately allow us to buy those properties in conjunction with the wealth that we've generated and the profits that we've made on the other properties or the businesses that we run. And all of that's being ingested into, this valuation cycle that's also occurring.
So the fourth one the key takeaway from the earlier points, Ben, is something that we have sort of highlighted today, but we're going to reinforce the point here that show us a city where the main industries are high paying, and we'll show you expensive cities. We'll show you expensive real estate in those cities because the land and the related prices will be inflated. So, you've gone offshore to have a look at this. There's some interesting examples. It's audio, so you can't see the visuals here, but it tells a pretty good story.
Yeah, look, this really sort of came home to roost with me on a recent trip to Singapore, and then having a look at the difference between Singapore and I think it's Johor, which is just 23 kilometres across a bridge, where that's Malaysia, right? And what was fascinating about, basically the prices in Singapore were 3 times higher from accommodation and transport and all of those things than what it was in Malaysia, right? And you're sort of thinking, well, wait a minute, that's a border, right? It's an artificial border. Yes, they're 2 countries, but it's like, how does that work? And so you've got to think about it from a capital growth point of view in terms of GDP growth per capita. So I went back and this was sparked from a podcast that I listened called All In Podcast. And they were talking about Sri Lanka and Malaysia and Singapore. And then I sort of thought, well, that's interesting. That's an interesting exercise to do. So I did the same exercise. So I looked at GDP per capita for Australia, Singapore, and Malaysia. Now, what is absolutely fascinating about this, and it's hard to see on the graph, but Singapore from the 1960s has radically changed. They were a very poor fishing village with basically slave labor, and it was just a trading port. But they have transformed their country over 50 to 100 years to being a powerhouse, a financial powerhouse of Asia, a gateway to Asia. And their GDP per capita has now surpassed Australia. So they had a GDP per capita of around $4,000 per person. That's now sitting, in excess of $90,000 per person. When we started in 1960 to look at our numbers, our GDP per capita was around, and I'm sort of guessing these numbers between the graph here because I didn't write them down.
About 27, Oregon?
Yeah, I think it's about 27. And we've gone to around that sort of just under 80, so 78, right? So we've been pretty good. But Singapore has just outplayed us, right? And this is they've created a flywheel that's so powerful that it's rocketed their wealth for all of their people and all of their situations to an amazing outcome. And I can go 20 kilometres into the neighbouring city on the other side of the island, from Singapore Island into Malaysia, and I can pay a third cheaper for everything because Malaysia has gone from the same starting point as Singapore of around that sort of 4,000 to 5,000 US GDP per capita, and is now sitting at around 41,000 US GDP per capita. And so that just goes to show you that's financially transformed that country, the living standards, the quality of life, the education, the medical facilities, the whole thing. And what we've also watched, and I used to go to Singapore as a kid with my parents, and I remember that $1 Australian would buy almost, $1.50 or almost $2 Singaporean, right? Now, $1 Australian will get me about 90 cents. So that's also the financial transformation that's occurring. Now, if we then link that back to property, and I say for those people who want to play along at home, just Google Property Guru and then just start looking at freestanding houses in Singapore, and you are going to be gobsmacked.
Yeah, it's mind-blowing.
By the prices. So I can give you, I pulled up a couple of examples, 1,207 square metres of land. Now, Singapore's a tile island, so there is scarcity here. They don't have an abundance of land. I get it. All those people who are saying it's not a good comparison, but it is a comparison in the sense that when this property, a 5-bedroom, 6-bathroom property, is being sold for 20 million Singapore dollars, you've got to recognise that the only reason you can ask $20 million for that particular property is because, and we'll put the link in the show notes so you can check it out because I've got the hyperlink there, then that's true. But there's another one here, like I just picked 2. This one's on 1,433 square metres of dirt. Now, this one is asking 56 million Singapore dollars, or in excess of $60 million Australian for a 5-bedroom house in that particular. And these weren't rare occurrences. Like they're obviously scarce assets, and that's potentially why. But then you start to look at the square metre of cost of their apartments, and you're talking around, sort of in that high 26, 27,000 square metres per square metre, per square foot of property price. So their apartments are worth millions of dollars in terms of that. And that's talking about land to asset ratio in a very, very poor situation. So it just goes to show you that you show me economic activity and you show me cities and areas that are thriving, and you will correlate that into improved land values and improved wealth of the people and the society in those particular areas. And that is ultimately, a really important message.
Very good. Now, we're about to wrap this up, folks, but we're just going to remind you of kind of where we've come from, because we started off by saying, will property prices continue to go up? We wanted to provide you with a thesis. We talked about short term and went into why there is, it's not the best level of trust. So that's why it's the voting machine. We then pivoted to long-term sustained price growth and talked about why it's a weighing machine, and built a case around land value being judged by three particular ways. It's productive use, the exclusivity and the status around the land, and also the level of economic activity. And then we've just spent the lion's share of the podcast talking about, okay, why is our thesis so strong that economic activity is the driver, then human interest and human behaviour follow? And then we've obviously demonstrated that in as best we can via audio when we're looking at some pretty rich stats. But the idea is to give you the sense that this is being supported by data rather than just being a theory. So I guess the closing message, Ben, is really important for people who are listening to this and they're going, okay, so what does that mean? I mean, here I am listening to you. I've been a loyal listener for some time. I'm new to your podcast. How do I actually take that into a takeaway and let this absorb so I can use it in my everyday life to seek advantage for whoever's listening to this?
Yeah, sure. So the fundamental takeaways here are really simple about understanding property values. Yes, in the short term, property values will be judged by the short level of demand and supply at that particular time. But over the longer level, they will be a byproduct of the localized economic activity. So if the economic activity continues to grow, then you'll have strong confidence that price value will continue to grow. So economic activity does lead to higher wages. Those higher wages then correlate into what we are as humans. We want to show off that in terms of a nice home with nice things. And so again, it reinforces our belief around an investor should ultimately always be a price taker, not a price maker. Those people who do, or those investors who go into areas that chase yield, I understand why you're doing that. And I understand that that is an absolute simple way. And it's another effective way of also creating wealth personally when it comes to investing in property. So this is not the only way to do things. But for those people who are looking for confidence about the long-term prospects of price growth, they've got to look at the long-term confidence of our economy. And they've got to look at that in terms of when they do their filtering down into the cities or the areas that they're going to buy. That's going to be important. Now, we didn't mention one area, which is really also, I know that there'll be people who'll be playing along at home going, but how does that explain the lifestyle locations? How does that explain, in Australia, the Noosas, the Portsies, the Byron Bays, how does that explain their accelerated valuation? And in overseas, the Monacos, the Hamptons, the Aspen, Colorado, those types of lifestyle centers. Well, they are more explained by the human status piece. So the human behavior piece, in terms of they are creating their significant wealth in the activities that they're doing in the other economic centers, but they're choosing to transfer that wealth, including tax havens, I might add, to those particular locations. So that's where it's an exchange of goods and services that have happened there. They've made their wealth there, and ultimately their compounding nature of their wealth is continuing to grow. And so now they want to show off that by buying in those particular locations or choosing lifestyle as part of that particular story as well. But they are an exception to the rule, and that's why we judge other lifestyle coastal locations at proximities and all that differently. But when you get a cluster of those people, which comes back to that point around the Veblen, the social psychology effect, that's ultimately what's playing out here. If you think about those rules, when it comes to that particular thing, I'll quickly go through them again. We are talking about social class, level of income, culture, subculture, family, and that reference group. If they want to be identified in that group of the uber wealthy, the mega rich, the mega successful, all those types of things, that's what's playing out there. They are transferring the wealth that they've made from those larger economic centers, or maybe they've made wealth in farming or whatever that they've done, but they're making that money show up in those. So that's an exception to the rule. So that
the point is it's coming from economic activity, isn't it, Ben? You said largely it's coming from the biggest centres. In some cases, maybe not, but it's largely transferring wealth into a status piece that's happened somewhere where the economic activity has been driven, and the flywheel is probably pretty significant.
Yeah,
to be able to pull it out, they probably own a home where the economic flywheel is at its core anyway.
Yeah,
this is surplus. So
the takeaway is back to our fundamentals that we said in one of our original episodes: human interest. Human behaviour, economic activity. But we have absolutely double clicked on economic activity. And we're continuing a student of this stuff, and it's really showing up when we think about 30, 50 years of research. It's really showing up in the data about the long-term weighing machine is very much centered around that growth in economic activity, which then flows on into wages and wealth, and wages and wealth then flow on into sustained property valuations and property growth in those areas.
There you have it, folks. That's why I get a front row seat to one of the brightest minds in this country. I love riffing it with him. It's been enjoyable doing it on this podcast and sharing it with our community. Let us know on socials. Should this be a chapter in the upcoming book to explain the future of property values, of how it is a voting machine in the short term, how it's a weighing machine in the long term? I think it's incredible. I've been super excited to share it. Hopefully you have been too. So, let that ponder, folks. Let that sort of sink into the decisions that you've made, the successes that you've enjoyed in your own property portfolio. I can actually, if you want to share those ideas with us, as I said, let us know on socials. We would love to do that. But big show, big episode, great one for us to finish off before we get off to the summer series, which we're super excited about, Ben. But my life hack today is from Stiggy. Sent me a little note that I had to sign, Ben. And I don't know about you, but we live in the digital age. And when someone sends you something to sign, you just go, oh, my gosh. Can you just send it to me in DocuSign? So I can just click the button, send it back, and it's all done. And unfortunately, in this situation, DocuSign was not an option. So then I did what everyone does when faced with that decision. You procrastinate on it, and you don't get it done in a timely manner. And then Stiggy showed me that in Adobe, you can actually do your signature pretty simply, and it's been transformational and it's changed my life. So Ben, for those of you playing along at home, you can go in Adobe and click at the top on the toolbar. There's a little pencil. So you click on that pencil and it drops down a couple of little more options, and then there's a signature, and you drop on that option. And number 3 allows you to do a custom signature. What you do, Ben, this is how ridiculously simply stupid it is for me to do. I do a little autograph on a white piece of paper, and then I flash that autograph up at the camera. And the camera, because the computers are smart these days, Ben, I don't know if you've noticed, they picked up my signature and then brought that in, and then I could save it. And then I just go into the white paper, I put the signature, save, off it went. So within milliseconds, I had solved a procrastination problem that had been lingering for some time. So I thought, I wonder if anyone else is a dinosaur like me, born in the 70s and hasn't quite cottoned on that technology is caught up super, super quick if there's no DocuSign.
Mate, can I add to that? Like, same thing with Microsoft Edge in terms of opening a PDF. You can actually put text boxes in, and you can also sign to it, and you can erase. And so, no longer should you need to print off a document and then sign it, and then basically scan it, and then name it, and then send it back. It should all be able to be done. If you make Microsoft Edge your default, or you go to Adobe and you make that your default, all of those tools are now available in there. So that's nice little hack there.
Game changer. Tip of the hat to the fossils like me. The youngsters probably just switched off and yawned instead of been doing that for years.
Yes.
But a little shout out to Stiggy here. Hey, what's making property news, Ben?
Well, Matt, I thought, it's been a massive show, but I just was interested in some of the research recently that came out through someone at the RBA decided to scratch the itch on this story about keeping up with the Joneses. And so did some research on this whole idea of the Veblen effect in terms of staying with that societal group and so forth. And the conclusion of this a bit of research was that it's not a problem for the lower socio-demographic, because they're not getting themselves into too much trouble in keeping up with the Joneses en masse. So they were thinking about it from a financial stability point of view. But certainly the middle class of Australians do try and keep up. But on a positive note, they're trying to keep up by investing, which is a good thing. So they're looking at, investments in properties and investments in shares. So that actually adds to the value. And so if they're trying to keep up and their nucleus and tribe are investing, well, they're also joining in, even if, they might be renting next to their neighbours because they don't own in that, that area of opulence or whatever it might be. But the other risk is they're also trying to keep up on the car side. So they did say, if you're trying to think about keeping up the Joneses, and the research also identified that, hey, you don't know what their financial situation is either. They could also be, basically geared to the hilt with bad debt instead of good debt. So, but conclusion was they didn't see it to be a major risk to economic stability across the country, so it wasn't going to be damaging. But in isolated pockets, it's certainly something of a concern in that middle class area where everyone's sort of saying, oh, you've just bought yourself a new SUV. Well, maybe it's our turn to go out and buy ourselves an SUV, but you're buying it with cash, we're buying it with credit, and so that's a bit of a risk. So it's a good reminder to and is a nice sort of way in which I can again plug, download the Moorr app, get it off your mobile, get it on your mobile device, put your numbers in there, have a look at that. And then obviously if you need to do money stretch and money fit, you go to the web version for the time being. There's lots to be done in there. But, Money Smart's on the go. That's where you start with it. But nothing to see here in terms of keeping up with the Joneses.
Ben, if you solve that problem, you might actually collapse the property market value because then, but if you solve that problem too, you might have no love songs because if we all cure our insecurities, Ben, and stop comparing to others, there'll be no love songs, there'll be no songs, there'll be no increase in value because we're trying to keep up. But good point, reinforcing that. Anything else, Ben?
Oh, there's a bit of spending going on over the course, of the next couple of days, Bryce. So we're in that sort of Black Friday, Cyber Monday period. Are we doing anything?
We might, mate. Stay tuned on that. We do like to offer a Black Friday opportunity. So
okay, good. So $6.2 billion they're expecting to be spent over this time period online. And if I put my little select residential property hat on as well, you might be seeing something on the property research side coming up on Monday as well. So just something to keep an eye out there for as well. If you're a member of the select residential property family.
Oh, very good. So if you go to thepropertycouch.com.au, leave your details there, give us your email address. We will make sure that you know about our Black Friday Cyber Monday special, but it sort of plays into today's episode, Ben, so how you can actually get access to information that will reinforce what we're talking about today.
Exactly.
With the armchair book. Woo, Ben, that is a big episode, mate. Well done. We got through it. Hopefully that has added some value. I think it will. I think it will help people get a better understanding of property values, hopefully gives them some confidence in the future, and also gives them an opportunity to zoom out a little bit, see what's going on at a world stage level, to give that as a comparison point, to give you some comfort around what might happen here in little old Australia down under, Ben, mate. But until next week, when we kick off the summer series, which is arguably one of the most fun times we have on this couch.
Inspiring times. It's an inspiring time for us. We just love listening to those stories. They are super inspiring.
They are super inspiring, mate. But until we kick that off next week,
knowledge is empowering, Bryce, but only if you act on it.
There you go. See you in the summer next week, folks. Hey guys, Bryce here again. Just want to catch you before you go and let you know, if you're new to our community, there are a lot of episodes to catch up on, but it's really important that you start from the very beginning at episode number 1, because episode 1 through to 20 share all of the foundational pillars and frameworks that you need to know to get the best out of listening to this podcast. So I'd recommend that you start there, and the little tip is to maybe start on 1.5 speed. Now, for those of you that are time poor and don't have time to go back from the beginning, don't worry, we've got you covered as well, because we've created a binge guide that goes through all of the details and makes it easy for you to read and get up to speed very, very quickly. So if you go to thepropertycouch.com.au/fast track, you will be able to download that binge guide and you will be up to speed in no time. And whilst you're there, I've got a few extra goodies for you, because we have our top 5 frameworks that you'll learn on this podcast, as well as the Make Money Simple Again ebook, which will help you with the foundations of basic money management, so you'll have everything you need to succeed in building your own lifestyle design and getting the best out of this podcast. Now, just a reminder that anything that we cover on this podcast is not considered financial advice. We certainly recommend that you get your unique circumstances looked at by your individual advisor, and everything we talk about is just general in nature. But folks, I want to encourage you again to go to thepropertycouch.com.au/fast track, and you can go and get all those goodies and catch up right away.